Hello, everyone, and welcome to Geekoscopy 101, the podcast that explores the intersection between science, story, and play with me, your host, Dr. Yanis Kiston. And today we're exploring the advent of computing with podcaster Sean Haas. Welcome to the show, Sean. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty well. Excited to chat to you. I was telling you earlier about how in an alternate universe I could be doing computer engineering, at least computer science. So when I discovered your podcast, I'm like living vicariously through you
That's good
while
to hear.
listening.
I'm always down to help people live vicariously in the digital world.
For sure, definitely. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do, Sean?
Yeah, so professionally, I'm a software engineer, which is a pretty boring sounding field. I think it's fun. I've always liked computers. As a hobby, though, I guess maybe it's more than a hobby at this point. Let's call it an unofficial job, I produce a podcast called Advent of Computing that covers the history of computers and broadly computing adjacent technology. Because, as it turns out, there's a lot of stuff that's not 100% computers that does really impact the history of digital machines.
For sure, definitely. How did you get started with computers? Where did the spark in your life inspire you to go down this path?
Well, I think like many practitioners, I was bit by the bug early. My dad, back in it was way before I was born, got a degree in computer information systems, and he never did anything with that. But because of that, he always had these old programming manuals and like textbooks that were kicking around the house. And I remember in middle school, I was really bored one summer, as one is in middle school. So I was sitting around and I started going through some of his old books, and I was thinking, like, maybe these computers are, maybe there's a little bit more to them than just like playing solitaire and checking emails. And so I started to teach myself how to program, and ever since then I've just been obsessed with the machines. They're fascinating. There's almost no limit to what you can do with them.
For sure, definitely. And when did you decide you're going to start podcasting about it? Because that's always a big step from doing it to podcasting, creating content.
That's a bit of a longer departure, I guess. So we were talking a little bit before we hopped on the call, but I am, in an alternate reality, I would have been a career academic. So I did undergrad in astrophysics, and my plan was to go to grad school, do the whole track, and become a professor eventually. But once I got to the point of grad school and actually signing up and doing all the paperwork, I decided against it. Just wasn't the lifestyle for me at that time. Hey, maybe one day I'll go back. But throughout undergrad, I did a lot of research and gave a lot of presentations on research, and I really liked that science communication part of the field. Well, I remember one of my professors told me that you can be the smartest person in the world, and that's not really worth much if you can't explain what you're working on to people. Then you're just kind of stuck in your own head. So I always, throughout my admittedly short academic career, tried to emphasize being able to give talks and lecture about my work. And that was something that once I was out of academics, I really missed. The other impetus that kind of helped is I've worked in the podcast industry for years. I used to work at a smaller company that did some podcast hosting. I wrote back-end stats software for that. And then more recently, I work for a larger company that will remain unnamed, doing the same thing. So I've been involved in podcasting on like the industry side forever. So I got to a certain point after deciding against grad school, where I was like, well, I really wish I could keep doing research, and I really wish I could keep sharing research with people. And I like to think that in an alternate universe, I was a career educator. So I was able to kind of put together my love of computing and my love of being able to do research and communicate science to make a podcast.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. If you were to go back to academia, would you do it in astrophysics or would you try and get into computer science instead?
So at first I've always thought that I would get a degree in comp sci, but surprisingly, physics and especially astrophysics these days is really computational heavy. So I think I'd probably just stick with
Mm.
astrophysics because it's a lot more applied than just doing computer science.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. How did you get it into doing astrophysics?
It was so when I originally got into college, it was kind of a split between either doing computer science or physics, like I was saying. And I ended up
Mm.
settling on physics because I wanted to feel like I was in a field that was more generally applicable than purely computer science. Also, the school I went
Mm.
to had a better physics department than their comp sci department.
When it
So
comes,
that kind of made it a no brainer, I think.
for sure. It's one of those things, especially like if you're studying like locally or you want to go to a specific university. Sometimes you just end up doing like what's best, or like studying in a field
Yeah,
that's already being studied at, because just like there's just better infrastructure and better like manpower around it.
exactly. And I
But it's
tried,
sometimes sad because you don't always you don't always get to do what you want to do.
right?
Uh,
I
but I think
tried
that's a
taking some comp sci classes at my alma mater and I just couldn't do it. They wouldn't let me test out. It's like, hey, guys, I know how to program. Let me leave. Just give me the degree.
yeah. So during your course of learning about computers and programming, what were some of the like common misconceptions you've seen with people about understanding computers and how they work and what they do?
It's a really good question. I think the biggest misconception I run into, especially with the podcast now and my historical context, is a lot of people seem to think that most of the technology we use day to day is new, which isn't necessarily true. A lot of technology has actually really old roots, especially when it comes to computers, which is something that's oftentimes surprising to people. I think the most canonical example you can go with is the internet. Most of the core technology that went into the internet was designed in the 1950s, or in some cases, the theory work was even earlier. So, for instance, ARPANET was the first attempt by the US government to make a network that was actually robust and wouldn't just fall apart at the tip of a hat. And that was based around the idea of having a distributed network that sent around chunks of data instead of whole like blobs. So on the internet, you don't download a whole MP3 file. It on the back end, very deep inside the network, sends around chunks of it that are reconstructed. And that turns out to be more reliable than sending just giant blobs of data. Other choices like doing binary instead of analog data, or even using phone lines, which for decades we did use for the internet, that all dates back to the 50s. And all of those are like just those four technologies are still core to the modern day internet we're using in the 21st century. And a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, the internet's so new. It came out in the 90s, but it's 50 years old. It's 60 years old by this point, but we're still using it because that's
Mm,
the best we have.
for sure. I think recently I googled like when was the first computer to come out, and I
Mhm.
was surprised to see that like some of the earliest dates were like 18, like the late like
Yeah.
18 like 79 or whatever. And I'm like, what? Like that's a totally different century to what I thought. It just seems that the idea for this stuff like started off early. It's just that it takes a while to get to like commercial level, and it takes even longer to get to like consumer level. But these things, the idea of them starts off really earlier than we think.
Yeah, and it's not just it's partly the ideas, but it's that humans have always had the same problems, right? Like someone working in a field has a different set of problems than someone working in an office, but at a certain point, it's like, oh, you still have to count like how many steps you're taking or how many bushels of grain versus how many cups of coffee you've had. There's all similar types of issues that people have been facing for ever. And computers, or at least something like them, have always been a need. So really early systems like the machines that Babbage was making in the 1800s, those are solving the same kind of math equations that are being solved on modern day computers. It's just using the technology that was available at the time. So in the 1800s, it might have been gears. Today, it's silicon, but still, fundamentally, it's just something that us humans really need.
Sure. I haven't fully gone through your whole catalog yet because most of it I don't understand. It's not being in the field. But do you do anything with like alternate history? Like, what if we didn't? If certain people didn't discover certain things at certain times, like would they have popped out like in other parts of the world? What's your favorite point in like computing history that could have like changed everything if it didn't happen?
Oh, I've done one episode about that. I try to stay away
Yeah,
from alternative histories because
yeah.
I like to speculate and I get off the train pretty quick. But I did one episode a while back. So I've been doing this long running series that ended last year on Intel processors leading up to the IBM PC, which comes out in 1981. The reason I was doing a series on that is the PC was kind of a watershed moment since it was the first home computer that had widespread adoption. And part of that was people were able to clone it and make like $100 IBM PCs instead of $1,000 machines. And that just broke the floodgates open for everyone having a computer on their desk. So once I finished that series, I did an episode talking about an alternate future where IBM didn't use Intel hardware for the PC, because that was one of the big things that made the PC clonable and possible to make cheaply. Is it used IBM used Intel chips, which were cheap. They're not made by IBM. Anyone could go buy chips from Intel. But there was a point where IBM engineers were discussing, well, what should we use for this new computer? And they looked at using this one Texas Instruments chip that was a lot more capable than the Intel chip they ended up using. And so I did a whole episode that was going over that Texas Instruments chip and then presupposing, well, what if IBM had chosen that, and then trying to sketch out what a computer might have looked like.
That is really interesting. I love alternate history stuff. I find it really interesting to speculate. Yeah, for sure.
I should do more speculative episodes, but like I was saying, I tend to get too far off into fantastical thinking if I let myself
yeah. You pull out the board with all like the strings.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah. So I've been hearing a lot, I think mostly on social media, about everybody should apparently be learning how to code in some way or another, because in the future, like, all the machines are going to steal our jobs, especially like the ones that don't like take a lot of, I don't know, human power, brain power, or whatever. I forget the correct term for it. Like, what's your feeling about that as somebody who programs for your day job and creates content around computer? Is programming something everyone should be learning, or is it fine if a lot of people don't know, or the majority don't know how to code?
Now, I can give you a complicated answer. A lot of my friends are also programmers, since that's just the circle I run in. And we always joke after hours that programming too much does something bad to your head. I think there's probably some kind of net detrimental effect after a certain amount of time. But I think if you want a solid career path, software development's pretty good. You have a lot of options, and if you tailor what you know properly, you can work almost anywhere. And I think that's a huge benefit of itself. For me, I personally think that programming languages are one of the most shining creations that humans have ever come up with, because there's just decades and decades of people trying to figure out how we can interface with these computers that we've built, because computers fundamentally, they're these inhuman monsters, right? Because they work off logic and ones and zeros, which that's not how we work at all. So programming languages and broadly programming in general is, I think, a real triumph of the human spirit, if I can be a little hyperbolic. So I think it does you a little bit of good to learn how to program, but on the flip side, there are plenty of downsides to working in the industry. I know I wish I could be outside more often. That's something that kills me, especially when it's nice out.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I don't think people realize about being a outside scientist like I'm supposed to be is that the majority of the time we are on our computers, actually, like sometimes doing programming, like using R to do statistical analyses, which I think is funny. Like I recently saw a meme about it, and they were like, I wish I went to like marine biology so I could spend most of my time like being outside. And like there's one comment is like, most of the public don't know what we do they? It's like, no, it's just not how it is.
Oh, I like it. And that, I guess that's another point about learning to program, is it shows up in places that you just don't expect, right?
Yeah, for sure. So R is definitely a language that scientists use for statistical analysis, and I think some Python is starting to creep in there. I did a workshop about it, which are this computational statistics side. I'm not a fan of doing the whole coding thing. I prefer having a point and click UI. But if I have to do it, I'll just do it. I can do it. So like I'm like totally inept at it. But
I think that's a good level to be at. It's a tool at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's definitely a tool. I think if you're gonna do something technological, I think having experience in some code that's contextual to what you are doing makes sense. But I mean, like, if you a farmer out plowing the fields, it makes no sense for you to not know any type of code.
I could cultivate a
unless
more rich inner life.
yeah, enjoy the sunshine, enjoy the animals. And also, like, don't you think that, like, with any kind of type of problem, like it took mankind's evolution a lot to get to a point where we could like communicate using like symbols and stuff, and it's one of the things that we use as a tool effectively to broaden our horizons. But don't you think that when it comes to like programming and development, there's some like entrepreneur out there is going to find a way to just like make it easy so that you don't have to learn how to code? It will be something that's like drag and drop or point and click, and then it'll code for you. Like, how far
Maybe
away you think we are from
day.
something like that?
So that's an interesting thing to think about, because we've been trying to do that for a long time and it never goes quite as well as it could, or quite as well as we think it could. I actually just recently was looking through these old papers from the 60s about this language called Oak Treat, which was just like you were describing. It was designed to be drag and drop, just point and click. And I got a demo of it built and was trying it out, and it was just awful, because when you get to the like down to the nitty-gritty of programming, you have to be able to describe really complicated ideas really precisely. So a lot of times, if you're doing a drag and drop interface, you get to a point where it's like, okay, well, I have this box that has 12 lines going to it, and I need to click on the 11th line and then drag that to this other box that also has 10 lines on it. And it just, it breaks down as complexity balloons. And also the fun, awful thing with this language, Oak Tree, that I was working with, is that it was really slow to program in, because instead of just hammering away at a keyboard. You have to go look through some menus and find the right things, then move it, find the right space to drop your little boxes into. So I think it's possible, but all our past attempts have pointed to failure so far.
So far, definitely. Yeah, there's always like pros and cons to certain things. So like increasing, I suppose, usability is going to be at the disadvantage of function, and trying to be as specific as possible with like referencing stuff, which is
like building into a niche can help. I know when I was doing research at the college, a lot of my friends who did experimental stuff used LabVIEW, and they liked that. And that was a drag and drop language just for data acquisition and analysis. So it was able to be okay because it only did like one thing. But once you get to trying to do general purpose as a visual language, that is definitely a bigger challenge to tackle.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, it's one of those. It's the history of programs. Is if you are wanting to do a very predefined set of things, then it would be easy to create interfaces that work. But as soon as you try to make it do something else, it's not going to do that. It can only do what you tell it to do. So when I was looking at like when the first computer come out, I was like 1800s. I was like, geez, that's going to be too far back to look into the future. So I was thinking, okay, like consumer computers, like personal computers, go back 4 decades, right? Which is
give or take
a more it's a period of time that you can think about. I think in a more defined way than like 100 years plus. So how do you think going in the next 4 decades computing is going to look like? What are the major like milestones you think we're going to hit in that time?
I think that's really hard to tell. One of the things that I've learned on doing almost 80 episodes now of my podcast is computer history is really unexpected. There's a lot of twists that don't make a lot of sense. Like the Ibm Pc is a great example. IBM was building that because they needed to make a little bit extra money while they were waiting for their next big release. And it ended up being the biggest thing in basically consumer history as far as computers go. IBM did not plan for that. And a lot of things that just catch people's imagination are totally unplanned. And conversely, a lot of things that are planned to catch people's imagination just fall flat. In the 70s, Xerox basically, they built a full graphical user interface that looks like a modern computer, and just no one wanted it. There were some people that were like, hey, that's cool, and we're going to take some aspects of that. But when Xerox tried to sell it, they sold like, I think 10 computers or something. Everyone's like, oh, why would we want this? What's a mouse? What even is that? So I think
somebody definitely lacked vision and marketing over there.
Yeah.
They had the tech down.
Perhaps. I think if we're trying to look for what's going to be the next big thing, it has to be something similar to what happened with Xerox, something that people are overlooking now, which that makes it a hard kind of search. I personally think that one of the bigger trends we'll see in the coming years for consumer technology is going to be more and more internet integration, because I think we're just starting to very clumsily use the internet at this point. I'm thinking of stuff like the Internet of Things egg trays that count how many eggs you have in your fridge. That's a real thing. They sell those online. So I think that's kind of emblematic of we're taking our first steps into figuring out what it means to have the internet everywhere. And we've been trying to grapple with what the internet really means since the 70s. So in the next 4 years, hopefully we'll have that figured out. I don't know what that'll look like, but I know that's going to be a big trend. I'd say that's probably the biggest to look out for.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of agree. I think what's probably stopping that innovation is that not everybody in the world has access to internet to begin
Yeah,
with,
that's a
and
good
not
point.
at a speed where you could do a lot of things. I mean, even like in America, like there's a lot of rural places that have like modern internet connection. And in Africa, like Africa barely has electricity, never mind internet. So
Yeah,
it's one of those things where the infrastructure has to come online. I think people would then realize just the possibilities that you can do with it. And I mean, there are companies out there who are trying to make it a like possibility, like beaming internet from space and stuff. And yeah, I think we are like on the cusp of a lot of those like Star Trek technologies that are like, okay, one like we're getting to an idea of things going to be like really high tech and going forward.
yeah, one
But
day. Yeah, that
I
the
also
access is a
think it's
good
different.
point.
I also think, yeah, I agree with you. It's one of those things that is so difficult to say because it takes a turn of events, and it might not even matter with the technology, but like the basic like materials that you would need, like metals like nickel and cobalt and stuff.
Mhm.
If there's ever like a shortage or we run out of something, that might totally change how we need to uh, the build the technology going forward. And I mean, I'm already hearing about roadblocks when it comes to basic materials, and I think the pandemic highlighted a lot of things, and the burgeoning, hopefully not World War III, is also highlighting a lot of things. Um, so it's going to
Yeah,
be interesting. I think we're starting to also, as far as like the horizon like looks bright, I think we're also like coming across a lot of walls that we are crashing up into in terms of just being able to get stuff done to progress technology. So yeah,
and I think
I'm with
with
you. It's
computing,
probably impossible to say.
yeah, and with computing though, we are lucky that we found a lot of ways around a whole lot of walls in the past. So I think at least for the digital future, things will probably be bright. I know one of my favorite things to think about is back when computers used to use vacuum tubes during this transitionary period where transistors existed but
Mm.
they were too expensive. There were a bunch of really exotic materials people were experimenting with to make vacuum tube replacements.
Mm.
There's some great research that was done on using cryogenic materials to replicate vacuum tubes in larger scale. So there's a whole lot of options, and I think especially when computer nerds are up against a wall, we tend to find really
Yeah.
high in the sky, far out there ways to get around it.
Yeah, yeah. It is one of those things where you kind of underestimate the fact that like necessity is the mother of invention, and like when you really need something, that's when you kind
Yeah,
of invent like something. And like yeah, Moore's law still has been working properly for the past few decades, and we are yet to actually run up to any real any real thing that'll stop that. I mean, right now, really, the only real thing that might stop it is like World War III, which hopefully,
well,
we hope that does not happen.
hopefully that doesn't stop
And even in
anything.
that case, wars tend to advance technology, especially like on a military and
Yeah,
computational level.
I mean,
Um,
circling back, ARPANET was developed because of World War II and the Cold War.
Yeah. Okay. Let's bring back to something more exciting, less about war. What are you looking forward to, like in the near future, like in the next couple of years? Like, what do you think is on the cusp of becoming reality that might change everyone's life, or at least make your life a bit better?
Right now, a lot of my friends and I are looking forward to a better online D&D platform. That's something
Oh
we've
yeah.
been struggling with on the very
What are
think
you
locally
using
level.
now?
We've been
Yeah.
using Roll20 since the last couple of years, and that's works like
Yeah.
50% of the time.
Yeah,
Buddy and I have been trying to set up
it's
a couple
online
different
D&D
options.
is a difficult thing. It's
It's
almost
almost
impossible to
there.
replace that in person.
It
It is,
is.
especially like now you can have like online calls like this, which is really nice. And you weren't able to
Yeah.
do this like 5 years ago, like not to this like degree. Yeah, I use Fancy Grounds and it meets my needs, but it's the user interface is not that great.
We've
There's
been
like
trying to set
pros
up
and
Foundry.
cons. Yeah, there's pros and cons. I've heard things about Foundry, but I just invested so much. It's like one of those like lost cost
Sunk cost
fallacies.
fallacy. Yeah.
Yeah. So because like I bought all of my books on Fancy Grounds, like, and it's like thousands of rands, hundreds of dollars. I'm kind of like locked in. Although I think I would jump over if D&D Beyond starts up a virtual table, because I do have some books there, and I mean, the way that their interface is really good when it comes to like running your character or reading material. It's nice to be able to read stuff like on a mobile phone app compared to like on a computer, which you like locked into with a computer program like Fancy Grounds. So I don't know. So like, yeah, what are you guys thinking about? Just Foundry, or are there other things you're looking at right now?
We keep trying to get Foundry to work for all our players, but you have to self-host it on your own server. So we have it working.
Oh, wow, jeez.
Like once a week, maybe.
Once a week.
So we might
geez.
be looking for another option soon. That's very near future computer tech, though.
Yeah, definitely. There was a program that just came out on Steam. What is it called? But it basically allows you to like create a map by just like dragging your mouse across. It'll like use procedural generation. Procedural generation to like create a map for you. And yeah, one of my friends got me onto it, and like every time he tells me something, my wallet always just gets destroyed, and it looks so cool because you can just like how you like on a like graphic software like drag like a square, you could just do that, and like a map will create and it'll populate with like furniture and everything, and like you can set like lighting. Yeah, it's like I used to spend hours like creating these maps in these other programs, and now it's like you just use AI to do it for you.
That does sound really nice.
It's called Dungeon Alchemist or Dungeon Alchemy or something like that.
I think I've heard that name before.
Yeah. So it's D&D thankfully has hit somewhat mainstream, at least in that culture. So we're getting new tech. I think D&D Beyond was probably the start of it. Other tabletop, virtual tabletops have been around, but I think the pandemic kind of pushed a lot of these technologies when it comes to online communication and online gameplay. At least like in-person stuff, because like the video game stuff has always been there. It's been there for a while, but virtual tabletops and Dungeons and Dragons is more akin to an online meeting than it is like an online lobby game. So
you're making it sound boring now.
But that's what's nice about it compared to like just playing Call of Duty. It's a different type of experience.
It's more social.
I'm with you. I'm looking forward to new D&D tech. It's going to be... I've seen some interesting things that I think are really cool. What I want right now is to be able to have animated maps, like a video instead of just like a static image. I think that would be really cool. And I don't think it would be that difficult to pull off programming wise. I don't know,
use like a GIF.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. It's gonna, I think, depend on developer will and how much time and money it's gonna take
for sure.
incorporate it. Yeah. Yeah, that is a interesting outlook for sure. But I'm sure we could go for hours speculating about new technologies. So Sean, why don't you let everyone know where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so my podcast is called Advent of Computing. It's on all major podcast apps. I try to do a good job of getting it available everywhere every time a new directory comes up. My website's adventofcomputing.com, which has links to all of my everything on it. And you can talk to me on Twitter at adventofcomp.
For sure. Definitely go check that podcast out if you're interested in computer history, which I think is really cool. So thanks so much for joining, Sean. It's been a fun chat, very enlightening.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for having me on.
We'll chat in the future as new interesting things come out. Yeah. Thanks so much and cheers.